just wanted to use that song and celebrate how great God is for dying on the cross, rising from the dead, forgiving us. So in our sermon today, we're going to be in Matthew 28, a sermon or a passage you've probably heard before, maybe a sermon you've heard before also. We're in a series about reaching the world. It's called Across the Block and Around the World because missions needs to be everywhere. Our goal is to bring the gospel all around the world. And sometimes, especially in a church like ours, the church I was growing up in, we always did a great job of sending missionaries. We would have the Hofflins and the Fabers and people like that. But us actually doing it was a different story. And my goal is to help us as a church reach the gospel, reach the world, as well as sending missionaries to do that. And so this is Jesus' big marching orders, the very end of Matthew, in Matthew 28. And it's right after the guards reported that Jesus rose from the dead. And it starts in verse 16. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came to them and said, "All authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." And that's called the Great Commission. It's a mission that Jesus sends us. And he says it's a co-mission because he's going to be with us. And that's the defining trait of the church, is that we are the people who, with Jesus' presence, go to the world and teach them to obey and make disciples of all nations. And so that's what we've been talking about, and that's what this church has existed to do for years. Ran across a book this past week called Bless, and interesting, I used a different Bless acronym. I'm going to use the one from this book later. Hopefully it won't be confusing, but it's a guy named Dave Ferguson. I've actually had a chance to meet once or twice. He's really good friends with one of my mentors back in the Midwest. And he wrote this book and talked about how he was wanting to become a soul winner, an evangelist. And when he was in college, he actually won a scholarship to a thing called the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association Training Center. And he was so excited. Him and his best friend from college went there. They spent 3 days just drinking from the fire hose, just taking it all in. And on their way back, they're driving from like Kentucky to Illinois, so about a 6 to 10 hour drive. And they see a hitchhiker. And so they pick this guy up, his name's George, and they bring him into the car, and like, this is going to be our first target. And so for 6 hours, George hears everything they learned over 3 days. And George can barely get a word in, but a few of the words is that he's homeless, he doesn't have a job, and he would like to accept Jesus. So by the time they get home, they call their pastor, and they're going to arrange a baptism service. They live in the dorms, so they go to the RA, and like, we just brought this guy to the Lord, he doesn't have a place to stay with. Could he stay in our dorm for a couple days until we get established housing for him? And the RA makes an exception. And George has a great meal that night, spends the next day, and on the second day is gone with the laptop, with the roommate's car, and $150. So his first evangelistic experience was converting someone from homeless to Christian to car thief. And you probably have stories like that. Maybe not the car theft side, but you've tried so hard to reach people. And I think sometimes as a church, we hear stories like that, or it seems so intimidating, and so we just stop. But my goal is to help us realize that there's practical things that we can do that'll bring the gospel to others. Because our goal is to actually bless people. We're not just here to be blessed. We could count 10,000 reasons until we go blue in the face. I love that song. I love the way you do the little drum thing. It's like the heartbeat behind it. And I love receiving from God. But if we're not giving for God, if we're not extending this, then we're not doing what we're called to do. And so today we're going to look at 3 things. One of them is going to be a little bit of a recap, where we're going to talk about how we're called to bless all nations. We're going to look again briefly at Genesis. I need to really learn how to put contrast in those slides. Then we're going to look at how we are empowered to bless the nations. Then our third point is that we actually can begin to bless the nations. You can't read any of that, can you, Grady? No. Okay. Someday I'll learn to put shadows around the typeface. Until then, pray for me. So our first slide, hopefully the rest will work, we are called to bless the nations. Remember like 3 weeks ago, we talked about Genesis 12 when Abraham was called from God. And what God told Abraham was that he was going to bless him, and through Abraham, bless all nations. And that's not the first time. That's a main story of the Old Testament and the New, is that God blesses people so that they can be a blessing. That whole theme of blessing started back in Genesis. If you look at the very first page of your Bible, the word bless is there 3 times. And I'm borrowing some of this. It's hard to footnote in a sermon. But Tim Mackey in the Bible Project just did a teaching on this. And Amy would catch me if I didn't acknowledge it. But on the very first page of the Bible, you see the word bless 3 times. The first thing that's blessed is the animals. So the plants, the ocean, the sky don't get blessed. But the first living things, God sees the animals and the birds and the fish and says, I bless them. Let them be fruitful and multiply. Then he creates man and women in his own image. And he blesses them. But there's a layer to it. He says, be fruitful and multiply and rule. So there's a bunch of things that are already being fruitful and multiplying that God blessed. And you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply yourself, but now you're in charge of them. You've got a responsibility. But then the last thing God blesses is the Sabbath day. And you can almost see that what God is doing is like, here's who you rule, here's the rulers, and here's the way you rule in my presence. And so this idea of blessing is taking God's presence and extending it through humanity in all of the world. And that's been the call all through the Bible. Throughout the Bible, you see this repeated again and again, that we're supposed to bless everybody. After Moses leads the people out of slavery and God parts the Red Sea, as he's beginning to give them the commandments, what God says is, out of all the people in the world, you're going to be my favorite, my treasured possessions, and you're going to be a nation of priests. Now, the word priest means a bridge builder, a connector. The Latin, you ever hear the word pontifex, which is pretty much bridge builder. And so what the priest was supposed to do is to take God's presence and bring it to everybody. And what's up here, and hopefully you can see that, is how the temple was laid out. And starting from the outside, if you're over here, this is the court of the Gentiles. Anybody can come in there. And then there's a wall. And only the ceremonial clean and special people were allowed to go in. So then you had the women, and they were in an outer temple. Then you had the inner courtyard where the men and the priests would go. Then you had the holy place where you had the candlestand and the incense. And then on the very inmost place was the most holy place where you had the Ark of the Covenant. And you could only go there once a year, only the high priest. And the way our instincts are built, the way most people deal with religion, is the goal is to get deeper in. I want to be the special one. I want to be that high priest. I want to aspire to that secret special knowledge. I want to be the one person in God's presence. But what God does is he flips the whole paradigm. And he says, it's supposed to start there and flow out. And I'm not sure if you love trickle-down economics, but it's trickle-down theology. So you start with God's presence in the most holy place, and it's supposed to keep spilling down and down. So God's presence is in the most holy place. It's supposed to go to where the priests are, to the men are, to where the women are, to the Gentiles. It's supposed to always keep spilling forth. That's why Jesus, when the court, it was either the court of the Gentiles or the court of the women that was taken over by money changers. And they were making money and they were keeping people from worshiping. Jesus wasn't just mad that they were selling it. He was saying this is supposed to be a place of prayer. It's supposed to be a place where anybody can go. And that's what the priests were supposed to do. That's what Israel was supposed to do, is to connect to everybody to God. And those connections can sometimes get hard to make. You ever do some wiring work? I'm a terrible electrician, but I've had to do it sometimes. We live in a kind of average-ish age house, but when we first moved in, a lot of the plugs were really loose and the cords would fall out. You'd be vacuuming and the cord would fall out. So I finally bought a bunch of electrical boxes and I'm going to rewire all of them. You know, figured do it all in a day because then we don't have to reset the clock on the oven a bunch of times. That's the biggest pain. And so I rewired all of them, and there was like 3 that didn't work. Now, the way most people view this is they would take those plugs and you would yell at them. Repent! The power is available. You need to do something so that you can access. There's plenty of power. What's wrong with you? You're not running my vacuum. You're not running my treadmill. You're not going to power up my computer. It's your fault. No, it's my fault. And if in that analogy, if I'm the priest and the Gentiles aren't connecting with God, what we often do is we want the priest to yell at the Gentiles instead of checking their connections. Turns out that in my garage behind the workbench is a fault finder. What are those things? The ground fault things that when I took it apart was triggered. And so I rewired those boxes like 20 times until I was ready to use words pastors aren't supposed to use. And then I remembered that there was that ground fault thing, and I plugged that, and everything started working. And sometimes that's what evangelism is like. That's what the church's job is like, is we've got everything that we're used to dealing with all wired up. Our connections are strong. And then suddenly, things stop working. Suddenly, our kids aren't coming to church. Suddenly, our grandkids aren't coming to church. Suddenly, people with tattoos aren't coming to church. Whatever it is, and we start yelling at them instead of taking that step back and saying, could there maybe be a paradigm, something that we're missing? Maybe we're the ones who have an issue. Maybe we need to check our connection to God. Maybe we need to check our connection to the world. There's been times I've done that wiring and forgot to turn on just one of those fuses. And so just being fast, turn them on, and just one of them slipped. And now why is this one not working? Rewired a few times, and pretty soon, it's a connection way that I'm not connected to the source. And so our goal is to be a blessing. If we're taking God and sending him to the world, then we have to make sure that we're connected to him. And that's essentially what evangelism is. Evangelism, to use that analogy, is wiring the world for God's presence and for God's blessing. To make sure that there's not a nation or a person or a tribe or a country where we're not bringing God's presence. It means that making sure no one in your family or no one on your block is lacking God's presence. And we're not alone to do that. Our first point is that we're called to do that. The second point is that we do this with God's help. We're empowered to do it. And this is where the Great Commission words come in. It's more than just a challenge to reach the world. There's a promise here. There's a theologian named James Montgomery Boyce, and he points out that there's 4 different alls used here. And they're a little bit hidden depending on the translation, but the same Greek word, panta, is behind all 4 of them, where you have God saying that Jesus possesses all authority, go to all nations, to teach them all things that Jesus taught us to believe, and I am with you all the days, is the way it reads in Greek. Every day I'm with you. And those are the reasons that we have help with this. Jesus says that I have all authority on heaven and on earth. And if you look at his ministry, his authority is always being challenged. From the very beginning, he starts teaching, like, isn't that the carpenter's kid? Who is he to teach with authority? And then by what authority do you drive the money changers out? By what authority do you heal on the Sabbath? Even when he was on the cross, they were saying, you have authority over the Jews? Are you really their king? Do you really have authority? And when Jesus rose from the dead, the question is, does Jesus have authority? Came back with a resounding yes. Yes, he has authority over death and hell. He has been sent by the Father. He is the king. He's the sovereign. And it's so important that he has authority over heaven and earth. There's another commentator named John R.W. Stott out of England. And he has this amazing quote about why it's important that Jesus says, I have authority in heaven and on earth. And I'll read it for you if that's too small. Where it says, the fundamental basis of all Christian missionary enterprise is the universal authority of Jesus Christ in heaven and on earth. If his authority was only on earth, if he were but one of many religious teachers, one of many Jewish prophets, one of many divine incarnations, he'd have no mandate to say to go to all the world in his name. He'd have to say only go to this certain people or to this certain tribe. But Jesus has authority over all the earth. That means all the earth is called to love and bow to Jesus. But his power is not just on earth. If the authority of heaven was limited just to heaven, and he had not decisively overthrown the principalities and powers, we still might proclaim him to the nations. But we'd never be able to turn anyone from darkness to light. Only because all authority on earth and belongs to Christ do we dare to go to all nations. And only because all authority in heaven is that we have any hope of success. Does that make sense? Let me break it down. Because he has all authority on all earth, we can go to anyone. We can go to Ecuador. We can go to Papua New Guinea. We can go to Marysville. Anywhere on earth is under Jesus' authority. But we don't just fight against people. We mostly fight against principalities and powers. People, things, and ideas that guard and guide and hold people's hearts. And Jesus beat them. And so we have the ability, as scary and as intimidating as it is, that we can actually conquer people's minds for Jesus. And by conquering, it's kind of a militaristic world. I'm not saying we go there and we take them by force at all. We're saying we're trying to take every thought captive and win people to Jesus. And that's the first point is we have of the Great Commission. He has all authority. And then he says, go to all nations. Go everywhere. The word nation means ethnos, so he's not looking at geography or territory on the map. He's looking at every tribe, every people group, every language group. So in India, there's about 1,000 different languages. Go to every single one of those. In our area, there's so many different socioeconomic groups, different languages. And we can go on with statistics, but I think you get the point. He's saying this is not just a white thing or a black thing or an Asian thing or a Marysville thing or a rich thing or a poor thing. It's an everybody thing. Go to everybody. So it's all authority, all nations, teaching them to obey all the things I have taught you, everything I've taught you. A lot of times when we want to reach people, sometimes we're tempted to water down the truth. And what I've learned is that people don't want watered down truth. Just look at what's happening on the internet. People would rather listen to a 4-hour interview than a 20-minute soundbite. That's why like Jocko Willink and Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and so many of these others, these long-form, long conversations, people are engrossed and are willing to listen to tough stuff. Then often they come to church and it's like, hey, here's 3 points on how to get out of debt and be happy. I'm going to leave everything hard out of it. That's not going to help anybody. When I was growing up in the 80s is when that seeker-friendly movement started happening and started having big churches filled with sermons about how to have happy marriages and how to get out of debt. And those things are important to learn, but if you're never teaching about the sovereignty of God, if you're never teaching about the authority of Scripture, if you're never teaching that there's actually a thing called sin and a way to repent, if you never deal with the hard stuff, then you're not winning them. There's an old saying that you win people to what you win them with. And so if you're only winning them with pizza and bubble gum and happy sermons about nothing, what you're winning them to is to pizza and to bubble gum and to a happy God who might not be the God of the Bible. So you can't water down his teachings. The word disciple, we're called to make disciples. That word disciple means student. And so think about the best teacher you've had and how did you learn from them? Did you want them to say, you know what, chemistry is so hard, so I'm going to make it really easy for you. You're not going to learn a lot of chemistry, but you're going to really like me. Is that one of your best teachers? In junior year, I think, of high school, I had a teacher named Mr. Adrian. He was my chemistry teacher, and he was amazing. I mean, honestly, he told a lot of stories about bears devouring people in Alaska. It was amazing, especially when you're like a junior high or a high school boy. You just want to hear about bears just gnawing on people's heads for a little while. Don't go to Alaska and be alone with the bears. That's the only advice I learned from him. But it wasn't, imagine if it was just bear stories. And then I had to sit down and take the final exam in chemistry. And would I think that Mr. Adrian was my best teacher? Or would I think that was a lot of fun, he was hilarious, and I failed? And if he was only just teaching dry chemistry and never took time to get our interest, then probably still wouldn't have been successful. There might be a few people, but would not have been one of them. But he was so impactful. When I started college, my goal was to be a chemistry teacher, not because I was good at chemistry or teaching, because chemistry takes math, and I'm not good at it. I took an advanced math class in college, and the teacher gave me a C with the promise that I would never take a college-level math class again. He's like, I will not ruin your career over this. I will not ruin your grade point average, but could you agree that you'll never take another math class, Tim? I'm like, yes, I will agree with that. He's like, okay, here's your C. That's called grace. But I wanted to be like Mr. Adrian. I didn't necessarily want to be a math teacher, but I wanted to be like him. And that's what discipleship is. We're teaching through our character. We want people to know what we know. We want people mostly to know who we know, meaning Jesus. But we do it in a way that we say, this is who I am, and this is how Jesus taught me. This is what Jesus is doing in my life. Why don't you hang out for a little bit and you can see if you can follow him. Then the last all is he's with us all the days. So I'll be with you every day. You're never alone. And this can be so important because we look around at all of our resources and we think, man, we've got this made. We can easily do this. Or there's no way we can do this. And the question is, what do we have? It's what does God have? There's a pastor named David Platt. Wrote an amazing book called The Radical Church. A lot about the suffering church. They actually do these services where it's just all dark. It's never televised. You have to kind of know about it to get there. And it's like, this is what the persecuted church feels like. And he gets hundreds, thousands sometimes of high school and college students wanting to be a part of deep teaching. They teach for hours and feeling what it's like to be a persecuted Christian. And he writes, he got called to a really big church. And he says this in a sermon on Matthew 28. And he says, "Be encouraged, follower of Jesus, for this mission is not based on who we are or what we can do. The mission is based on Christ's presence through his church." When I first came to this church that I'm now pastor of, I recall thinking that the church had such potential with all of its gifts, all of its resources, all the big givers. But that's not a biblical mindset. It doesn't matter how gifted the church is or how materially blessed it is or how many talented evangelists it has, because we can do nothing apart from the power of the Holy Spirit. However, when the Spirit works among the people, that church can shake the nations for the glory of God. Rather than being based on what we can do, our mission is based on who Jesus is and what he's able to do in our lives. Christ is able to do anything beyond all we ask, hope, or imagine. So we should give Jesus the blank check of our lives, and together we'll experience his power. I love that. He got called, I think it's in Georgia, this big affluent church. I just imagine like the CEOs of Chick-fil-A and Coca-Cola and all these people who are in this church. He's like, it doesn't matter how much you give. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. It matters is that we have a Savior who has authority over heaven and earth, and he owns the hearts of the people we're called to reach. And then sometimes we're in a smaller church, and maybe you're looking around thinking, oh, we're an older church. We haven't done a lot of evangelism. We can't do this. Jesus is here. Jesus is here. You know what Jesus wants for this church? Jesus wants this church to change lives and to reach nations. Doesn't mean that we're going to be a giant mega church. That's not at all the goal. But the goal is to make sure that we're reproducing and sharing the gospel. And the question isn't, do we have the right pastor or the right people, or do we have the right gifts or the right training? The question is, do we have the right person in his power and his teaching and his training? And that person is Jesus. And he wants to save your kids and your grandkids. He wants to save your neighbors. He wants to make sure that they have an eternity with him and a present full of hope. That's his goal for your family. And if we jump on his coattails, he'll do this with us, and we'll shake this world for Jesus. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to bless the nations. We're empowered to do it. And as we close, our last point is, how do we actually start? I had a professor in college, and he would read books, and he always put YBT in the margins, yes, but how? A great point, but how do I do it? And sometimes I leave church feeling like that, like, okay, I want to change the world. What do I do? How do I actually start? And that's the book I mentioned at the beginning from Dave Ferguson. It's called Bless. And a few weeks ago, I used a thing by Gary Smalley about Bless with be committed, loving touch. This one's better. I wish I'd have read this one first, but God didn't want that to happen. He's sovereign, right? So his Bless paradigm, I think, is very helpful. The first one is begin with prayer. If everything we just talked about is true, that Jesus is the one with authority and Jesus is the one who is with us, then don't think you do this without Jesus. Talk to Jesus about your kids and grandkids and neighbors before you talk to your neighbor about Jesus. And the more you pray for them, even if you're shy, even if you don't think you could ever mention Jesus to them without blushing or without stumbling over yourself, at least talk to Jesus about your neighbor. Jesus will do things that you can never imagine. And so you take your kid or your grandkid or your best friend or whoever it is, and you just lift them up to God. And you pray for them specifically. Maybe you write down, last week I encouraged you to take 3 names and write down 3 names and begin to pray for them. Just like every day, I'm going to pray for these kids. Every day I'm going to pray for that grandkid. Every day I'm going to pray for that neighbor. Every day I'm going to pray for that same clerk I see at Safeway. Every week I'm going to pray for that person. And then you listen with care. That's the L. Listening is an act of love. And honestly, listening is something we're really not great at as a culture. So even if you don't win them to Jesus, you're going to do a lot of good and psychological good and healing in people's lives just by listening to them. As we listen, you hear their stories. You hear those places of pain. You hear what they're going through. And so many times we're so busy, we just want to get out. But we just stop and you listen. 2/3 of people in a recent survey said that they had no one in their life who would listen to them in detail. We have a lot of superficial friends, but not many people have someone who they think they could call today and have that hour-long conversation. So you listen. The E is eat together. This is so important around families, and a lot of families have gotten out of that habit where you actually sit down at this thing called the table, and you take those phones and you put them away, and you talk. But you also take somebody you've been praying for them, and you're not ready to share the gospel. You have no idea how to do that, but you can take them to Olive Garden or to a real restaurant, and then listen to them there. Just begin to build those things. I have nothing against Olive Garden. It's just the microwave is a really good chef. I don't know. I've never cooked at Olive Garden. But you begin to just get those things together. You begin to listen. You begin to build those habits. That time together. In olden times, if you ate together, you were considered family. I think there's something to that. Where you sit down and you take that time and you're not always on your phone. You're not always distracted. You're not always looking at your watch. You talk. The S is serve and love. And that's just simple acts. It can start anywhere. I told you this when I first got hired. When COVID happened, it was Erica's idea to put signs around the neighborhood. Like, if you need help with groceries or anything during this pandemic, we were able to get around. We've got older people in the neighborhood. We'd be willing to do shopping. And even though it was Erica's idea, the only person who needed help was the lady next door who needed her lawn mowed, and that's my job. So thank you. No, it's actually been great, though, and getting to know her and listening to her and hearing her stories. And yesterday I was outside doing some refinishing of a changing table, and she stopped by and made a little conversation, and she's asking about my kid, and all this stuff is beginning to build. And I've not yet shared Jesus with her in like an official, like, you know who Jesus is, but we've listened, we've talked, we serve her. She knows that she can count on us for anything. But then that last one is share your story. And sometimes that's last, sometimes that is first. This isn't a sequence of events. In some relationships, you start listening, they're like, well, what about you? And you can begin to launch into the hope that you have. Or sometimes this could take 2 months or 2 years. God's in charge of opening hearts. We're in charge of always being ready to have a defense for the hope we have within us. We're in charge of being out there and risking to bless. If you believe in predestination, you believe that God is calling people to himself all the time. But he uses us as his secondary means. So that means that we step forth. And the reason I think, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but predestination is this idea that God chooses, God opens hearts. And a lot of people think, well, because of predestination, why would you reach anybody? Go look at the history of missions. The people who believed in predestination were the ones who went to the world because it wasn't up to them. They didn't have to learn the language of New Guinea. They didn't have to learn the customs of New Guinea. They just had to go with the foolishness of preaching, as Paul says, and present the gospel, and then God would open hearts. And so you might not have the right words. You might not have the right way to listen. You might not know how to do any of this, but you have a God who loves your neighbor more than you love your neighbor. You have a God who loves your kid and your grandkid more than you love them, if that's even imaginable. And he wants their heart to be healed. And so you put yourself out there and you say, God, I don't know how you're going to do this, but would you save my kid? You pray for him. Any chance that they start talking, you start listening. You try to carve out specific ways that are unstructured, like a meal. You serve them. You get ready with your story. And as you begin to do this, you might see some failures, you might see some success, but you will obviously and definitely see God's presence. And for me, the goal of this is not just to reach the world. It's for God to reach deeper into my own heart. And both of those happen together. As I reach out to others, as I share and I bless with them, God has to step up and take care of my insecurities and deal with my fears and assure me that he's with us. And so I draw closer to God as I bring the world closer to me. So I don't know if you have any stories about picking up hitchhikers and turning them into car thieves like Dave Ferguson had. But I would love to hear more stories like that. Stories of failure, stories of success, stories of how we're sharing the gospel. And so my challenge is, if you've got that list of 3 people, start looking for ways to do these steps of blessing them this week. And if you don't have that list, then today, before the Super Bowl, sit down and just say, okay, who's in my life? Which of my grandkids hasn't been in church, doesn't know about Jesus? Do I have any kids? Do I have any neighbors? Someone I talked to at the gym? Whoever it is, just put their name down on a Post-it note. It's just that simple. The way our brain works is once you start thinking about things, then you start seeing places where that can happen. Like you start thinking about getting a red car, and then you see red cars everywhere. When we were in Maui, we rented a Camaro convertible because we're really tourists. And everywhere were Camaro convertibles, and you would just wave at them. We called them our Camaro bros because they were just our friends. No one else ever waved back. But once your brain starts thinking about something, you see it everywhere. And if you get your brain and God's Spirit thinking about the people that you love and how to bless them, you'll be amazed what God will do. So let me close this in a word of prayer, and we'll have our last song. Heavenly Father, you know the people in my life who are far from you. And Lord, you love them more than I will ever be able to love them. So I pray that you would open their eyes and their hearts and their minds to your word. And Lord, there are stories and people like that all around this church where we've got kids and parents, neighbors, people that we love and care dearly about. And they are so far from you, and we feel so powerless at times. So Lord, I pray that you would come. You'd make us your instruments, but that you would come in, Lord, and that you would change their lives. And let us be part of the adventure of seeing them connect to you. And so, Father, take this church and put it in your hands. Lord, make us a church known for worshiping you, known for loving you and celebrating who you are. And as a part of that worship, help us to invite so many others to be a part of what you're doing. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Well, for our song as we go out is Sent Forth by